What's going on, people? Myke C-Town here. So back in June, I was invited to be part of a sort of panel discussion about punk, the concept of punk, what punk means to me and other people. So I got the video recording of that discussion recently, and I wanted to share it with y'all because it was such a cool experience for me to be a part of. And because it ended up being such a short discussion, I figured I'd expound on a couple of the points that I made there. So first off, shout out to the homie Adon Bean for recommending me for this event. He's an amazing poet, rapper, thinker, orator, all of those things. And yeah, his information is down there in the description section. But this was put on by Creative Mornings Atlanta. Creative Mornings is an organization that have like 200 chapters throughout the world, which is really, really cool. They offer free events for the community, and they mainly want to promote the arts, you know, visual, audio, any kind of arts, right? And this particular event was at ABV Gallery, which is in East Atlanta, and they're a cool art space that features a lot of local and independent art. And it was hosted by Amina Brown. She's an incredible local poet who I've been familiar with for a very long time. Her information is also in the description section, but they wanted to cover the idea of punk as a culture from multiple aspects. And to appropriately do this, they had three of us speak and give our different ideas of what punk is and what it means to us. There was yours truly, but there was also Yvette Spradlin, who runs Punk House Atlanta, which is mainly an Instagram page that serves to archive the punk scene of Atlanta. It's a really dope page, and you should definitely be following it. But it was really cool to hear her talk about why she started that page and some of the other things that she has going on in relation to punk. She also had Randy Gu there, who's the founder of the Atlanta Punk Archive at Emory, Atlanta. They also had Frico Rico, who's an illustrator from Atlanta that I wasn't previously familiar with, but he's really dope. He basically talked about how he got into art and how he approached art in a fairly non-conventional way, even though he didn't all the way realize that when he started doing it. And he had one of my favorite statements throughout the entire event.
I've been told I have a political tone, but I'm just black. Yeah.
For my part, we just kind of talked through what I thought punk was and how it influenced me. Now, when it comes to things like this, I'm an over-prepper, okay? Meaning I want to know the exact questions like months in advance so I can script out my answer, study my answers, memorize them, and recite them back when asked. You know, I'm good at bullshitting, but only about things that I'm not actually interested in. You know, not stuff where I actually care about how my answers come across. But for this, I was prepared, but not extensively. This was more of a conversation piece between me and Amina. It wasn't like a TED Talk. So this was really cool. Plus for this, I didn't sweat it too hard because I honestly thought there'd only be a few people there, like maybe 25 or something, but I was super wrong. Okay, there was a full room. So I was pretty sketched out about having to answer these questions mostly off the dome.
Okay, I want to start off asking you, how would you, I'm using the word define here very loosely, but how would you sort of give us words for what punk is? Because I think sometimes when there is a culture as large as punk became, sometimes there end up being, and a friend of mine and I were talking about this, sometimes punk ends up having an aesthetic.
Sure.
That people are like, oh, it must be those boots. It must be this type of style.
Sure.
But they may not also know, like, how do we arrive to there? What are like the depths of what that culture is? So from your experience in punk, how would you define what punk is?
I'm glad you brought up the whole idea of aesthetic, because I think a lot of people will think of punk as just a bunch of people with, you know, mohawks and green hair, and they haven't showered in a week, and they're just like, you know, just breaking shit for no reason at all. But I think that the punk scene that I came from was very special in that it was welcoming for weirdos. And as someone that was a weirdo when I was well, I'm still a weirdo, but like through high school, you know, I'm one of the few people that I can confidently say that if I had not found the punk scene when I was a teenager, I would not be here, period. And I don't mean like spiritually here. I mean, literally, I'd be gone. I found the punk scene and it was extremely inviting to someone like me who thought about things differently, but I didn't know there were other people out there that did the exact same kind of thing. So I think the main takeaway from punk is that it's about thinking about things differently and not shaming other folks for maybe having an alternate opinion than you.
When it comes to the punk aesthetic, what I was really trying to get across here is that the common misconception of what punk is that punk is a uniform, right? Oh, that person's punk because they dress kind of crazy. But I wanted to point out that it's a bit deeper than that for some folks, right? It's not really about how people are dressed, it's about how they think and how they act. I really wanted to mention this welcoming for weirdos thing because one of the most beautiful aspects of punk for me was that, I went through high school thinking that something was drastically wrong with me because I thought about things in a way that didn't make sense to the other kids around me. I chose to dress differently. I was attracted to music that other kids that look like me weren't attracted to. So yeah, I just assumed that something was really wrong with me until I found the punk scene. And for the most part, it was extremely welcoming. The people that were there embraced other kids who didn't have a place where they felt comfortable. So my answer to this was fine, but I actually would have added some caveats if I had the time. I said that punk is about thinking about things differently, but not shaming folks for having an alternate opinion than you. And sure, that's true for the most part, but only to a degree. There's actually nothing wrong with shaming people for having an alternate opinion than you. If we're talking about people who are out to oppress other people, and I'm talking about fascists, I'm talking about racists, misogynists, homophobes, transphobes, I think those people deserve to be shamed, and I don't think that they have any place in punk. Wait, how do you get to decide who gets to be a part of punk? I don't, but this is my channel, and I get to say how I feel about the people who want to be involved in punk. Okay? And I'd also like to point out that when I was heavily involved in the punk scene in the 90s, we definitely shunned people who were different, like metal dudes or, rando jocks who just showed up at shows. And if I could go back in time, I'd definitely not be a part of that because being welcoming to those type of people could have created far more allies, which is way more important than upholding some stupid punk status quo. Punk to me is about looking at the norm and actually questioning if that's for you. Questioning if the most commonly accepted answer to the question that you're asking makes the most sense to you. If the majority of people around you say the most effective way to live a happy life is living your life according to the Bible, then I think punk says, why is this the most effective way for me to live my life? Or if people say something like immigrants are the problem in this country, right? Punk says, how does this person moving to a country I live in affect me in a negative way? And why are people thinking this way?
Let me ask you this about punk also, because one of the, I'll put out there what I'm thinking. One of the sort of tenets of punk belief is to be anti-establishment, right? And so we're in an era of time where in order for us as a community to care for one another, to thrive, we're going to have to be anti-establishment. Can you speak to how you being exposed to anti-establishment thought influenced you as an artist or influenced the adult you became? Because I also want to make a reference here that when we look at sort of generations before us, right, and we think about the time of revolution that was here in America in the 60s, then there were some people who were hippies, and then they were like, oh, boop, I just ended up in corporate America. And now I'm like, wait, what were those things? But then there were some people who were hippies that kept that hippie ethic, right? And I feel like punk is one of those things that some people keep the ethic, even as they grow older. So tell us more.
Yeah, I think that that's something that punk doesn't get enough credit for. I know, how people will look at The Simpsons and they'll be like, oh, The Simpsons predicted this, The Simpsons predicted that. I genuinely feel like punk was doing that throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s. There was always this I want to think it was a healthy level of awareness with a touch of paranoia. A lot of me and my friends always thought of the government as being fascist, or at least fascist adjacent, right? And we always thought of, at some point, the government is going to go all the way there and actually put a crypto-fascist in office, which is what has happened. But I think that punk was always kind of on the forefront of these things, talking about things that other people were not talking about. I can give one example, the genocide that's happening in Palestine. That is a very hot topic right now, which it should be, but I found out about this genocide through a band called Propagandhi that put out a song called Haile Selassie Up Your Ass. And there was a lyric in there that says, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, soon to be parking lots for American tourists and fascist cops. Which, if you listen to our crypto-fascist that is in office right now, these are things that he has flirted with. So this was in 1993 that punks were talking about this. Now, of course, me as an adult, a bit older, I kind of think like, well, why weren't they listening to us? Well, maybe because we were dressed crazy and we were screaming, and they just thought that these were just like weirdo kids. But if you go back and trace the history of punk, a lot of things that are happening today were being discussed back then. Even the ideas of, a lot of things. I know we don't have time to get into everything, but yeah.
I've said a few times on this channel that punk doesn't get the respect that it deserves for predicting things, good or bad. I think a lot of people from the punk scene saw a lot of these horrible things that are happening today coming long before they publicly arrived. When I talk about the idea of believing that the government was fascist adjacent, that was a narrative that was clear through a lot of the bands that we listened to, from the Dead Kennedys to His Heroes Gone to Destroy. All of these bands tried to instill the idea in folks that things were not good just because they were good for us, right? A lot of these bands taught us that in order to secure a world that was worth preserving for generations after us, we have to actively care about our neighbors and our community, which is something that I'll get to a bit later. But the idea that being inclined to speak about the injustices happening, even if they're only happening around you as opposed to you, that's a concept that is very popular today, but this is something that I learned throughout the 90s. If you have the privilege of having a voice loud enough for people to listen to, then you have an obligation to speak up for those whose voices are ignored. And the idea that America would eventually put an actual crypto-fascist in office would have sounded like ridiculous paranoia to most people if you heard it 20 years ago. But this was a common thing that you'd hear from the stage of a punk show in between songs. And I've heard so many bands speak out about the so-called leader of the free world and how they directly push fascism through policy. And this is long before we had a clear fascist running the country. And this isn't something that was just said about people like Reagan or both Bushes. I'm talking about Kennedy. I'm talking about Clinton. I'm talking about Obama. Through punk, I learned to be skeptical of any politician, including the one I was raised to think was a just and fair leader, just by virtue of being the figurehead of the country that I was born in. The example I gave about Propagandhi talking about Gaza, this is one of the clearest examples I could give about this idea of punk talking about and predicting things long before they happen or before they become public common knowledge. In 1993, I didn't know anything about Gaza, Israel, or the West Bank. I didn't even know where those places were. But because this amazing band that I loved talked about this issue, I just had to take the time to look it up and see what was going on. So while a lot of folks thought that this genocide started on October 7th, a lot of others have been aware of this atrocity happening for literal decades. Now, me mentioning Propagandhi talking about Gaza was not at all to say, oh, look, I'm so cool because I knew about it before you did, blah, 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 blah. Because look, that's not actually the case. I knew about the conflict, but it's not like I was doing anything about it. I wasn't organizing sit-ins or creating fundraisers to get supplies to Palestinians, or even doing my part to spread the word as much as I should have been, right? It was just one of the many fucked up things happening that punk told me about that I would have otherwise known nothing about. And my point in bringing it up was just to say, go back and trace the history of punk, and you'll see that punk was talking about things that are very important today long before a lot of other people even knew about them. I think a problem with punk is that we tend to get settled in with how fucked up things are, to the point where sometimes we don't even bother talking about these issues as much as we should anymore, because we just don't see a point. Because after a while, we just think that things are not gonna change. And, I'm glad that the generations past mine don't have that mentality. A lot of people are convinced that their brand of activism is going to change things. And I love that. Like, that's punk to me.
Talk to me about punk and its influence on art, because we can look at punk's influence on music. Sure. We can look at punk's influence on fashion. We can look at punk's influence on visual art. For yourself as a music head, as also an artist, a visual artist, how would you say punk influenced you in those regards?
In that regard, I think the way punk influenced me there is that there's always been this idea of if you have something to say, just say it. And it never held to this idea of like traditional talent when it comes to music or art or anything else. It was like, well, if you have something to say, just figure out how to say it. You know, especially with music, if it was like, you know, if you want to start a band, start a band. Like Randy said, start a band today. You know, if you don't know how to play guitar, figure it out. If you don't know how to play drums, bang on shit. Or in my instance, if you don't know how to sing, just scream, you know? Just figure out a way to get that creative outlet out there. So yeah, that's something I still hold today, which you mentioned Dead in Hip Hop, which is something very interesting with hip hop, is that's kind of the same trajectory. You know, we don't have money for this expensive equipment or all this stuff. We'll just figure it out. You know what I mean? We'll borrow things or we'll experiment with things. Like, you know, I think that punk really instilled that idea in me, and I still have that now with doing YouTube stuff. You know, I wasn't gonna wait for Complex or BET to come knocking on my door to say, hey, you want to talk about hip hop in this different way? No, we'll just do it ourselves. You know, we'll just figure out a way and we'll upload it, and if people like it, they like it.
I think one of the most important aspects that I took from punk is the rejection of the idea of what talent is. You know, you had bands like Crass who really had shit to say, but they weren't musicians in the sense of playing guitar like Jimmy Page. So instead of just like leaving creating music to those who were traditionally good at playing, they just figured out how to make sounds that worked as songs, right? Like the band Frail had this tagline, make your own noise. And that always resonated with me. Like, make your own version of what you want to hear. It may not sound like what that person is making, but it still holds the same level of value. And that idea extended to the way that I view visual art as well. You know, I like some of the artists who are traditionally good at what they do, but I also like the artists who break the rules, like Pollock, like Munch, like Basquiat. You know, those were punks of visual arts to me. It even extended to how I write and enjoy poetry. You know, I like a lot of the traditionally important poets, but not all of that stuff spoke to me. You know, I was more attracted to the almost disjointed way that Octavio Paz writes, or the vivid and kind of visceral but gritty way that Bukowski writes. You know, that's even what attracted me to Current 93, one of my all-time favorite bands, because I loved the odd way that David Tibet writes his prose. That idea even extended to how I look at hip hop. You know, a lot of y'all who watch me on Dead in Hip Hop will remember that I championed stuff that was super lyrical, but also the stuff that was more tied to stretching the idea of what hip hop could be. You know, the Def Jux, the Quantum, the Anticon edge of hip hop. Like, that was the stuff that attracted me because, you know, punk taught me that challenging the rules of the art form made the art far more interesting. You know, you saying, well, rap is supposed to sound like this, and the artist saying, okay, cool, but I'm gonna do it like this because that's what it sounds like to me. I thought that was dope because it also sparks these really interesting conversations. Someone who's tied to the old way of something will instantly get defensive about a new way of something because their perceptions are being challenged. Like, when you have to defend something, that keeps the conversation going, which keeps the culture surrounding that music, that musical genre or that subgenre. It keeps all of that active. At least that's the way I see it.
Last question for you. What can we do to keep punk culture alive in Atlanta as we're watching our city change in some ways that are good and some that are not good? How do we keep that punk culture alive?
That's a good question. I think that punk culture is very much alive in Atlanta. I think the beautiful thing about it is you can't really easily identify who that punk is. You know, back in the day, like I said, you saw that mohawk, you saw the green hair. Now you might see a suit, and you don't know, but that guy's punk as fuck. You have no idea, you know? He might wear that suit during the day, but at night, he's, you know, helping people that have been put in jail unjustly get out easier or whatever. So I think that the easiest way to keep punk alive is just to keep talking about it and to focus more maybe on the activism side of punk. And, I'm not going to say go out and break shit, but go out and like focus on what's affecting your community, because that's something that punk was very, very strong about, was community policing, community engagement, all of these things. So yeah, I think that that's something that's very, very, very important to keep an eye on and to focus on.
So for this part, I tried to go for the idea that judging people based on how they look and how punk you may think they are is super whack. But I don't think I got that across well. But back in the day, like, you'd see someone in a band shirt with colored hair and tattoos and, the uniform, and you'd automatically assume that that person was into some sort of alternative culture. And that seems shallow now, but that's only because we've moved past that, because those surface level aesthetics have become associated with common culture instead of counterculture. And that's okay, because punk should never be about costumes and uniforms, says the guy who wears nothing but band shirts and jeans every day. But I think the point that I was trying to make is that punk is more than a musical genre. Punk is more than dressing funny or trying to be as offensive as possible. To me, punk is really a mindset. I think that's a really important aspect of it. I think the mindset is what drives the music a lot of the times, and the mindset is what's going to actually change things within our communities, within our states, and hopefully within our worlds. Punk is very strong on community. The scene I was involved in believed very much in uplifting each other and pushing each other to be better than we were. Now that didn't always come across, I made a lot of pig-headed, judgy asshole mistakes in my life, but when I look at the scene as a whole, I think it was very much built on changing things for the better, but realizing that a lot of that started within our own communities. Hearing conversations about social movements and harm reduction, that was regularly heard at punk shows. It was very uncommon to go to a big punk festival or hardcore fest and not have multiple workshops happening where people were sharing information with each other about how things could be done to affect change for ourselves, but also for people who were less privileged than us. I think punk was way ahead of the curve when it came to the idea of policing and what that looks like without the state. I said community policing in my talk, but what I meant was the community policing itself. Not really the idea of communities working with police, because ew. So I totally misspoke there. But I was talking about the idea of your community identifying issues that affect the health and safety of your community and figuring out a way to handle those issues in a way that positively affects the offended, but still maintains the humanity of the offender. But I think right now we're in a time where it's critical to evoke the inner punk in us all. In a time where fascism is not only on the rise, but I feel like it's officially arrived in the United States. People are being kidnapped off the streets and disappeared, and because some Americans don't see immigrants as having the same human value as those born here. Women are being stripped of autonomy. Queer people have gone from being othered and attacked by bigoted and rogue groups to actually being actively targeted by the state. POC, who have been active enemies of the state for decades, we're just having even more difficult parameters put on the ability for us to progress in this country. We're at a time where the United States is declaring anti-fascism as terrorism, and a lot of us are ignoring just how dangerous this is. Universities are having their programs attacked if they focus on anything opposed to conservative thought and action. Funds are being reduced or eliminated if you don't fall in line with promoting conservative thought. I've spoken at a few colleges about hip hop culture, punk, metal, anti-fascism, and I've been looking into doing this stuff more. But it saddens me that with the state that the country is in, with the fucking garbage administration that we have right now, that's just not gonna happen, at least no time soon. All because we have a fascist president who thinks the best way to maintain power is to create a scapegoat enemy and direct the hate and anger of as many people as possible at that scapegoat enemy. The same hate and anger that he knows should be directed at him, his trash administration, and his rich and powerful friends whose only chance of preserving the power and the ability to oppress the rest of us lies in the common person remaining ignorant and confused about who we should be fighting. This is unfortunately the reality that Punk has prepared a lot of us for. You know, a reality where everything that was decent about this shithole country has been eroded away while we continue to confuse our neighbor for the reason that our lives are so difficult. And I fucking hate it. But shout out to Creative Mornings for having me. Shout out to Amina Brown for having this conversation with me. Shout out to Greg Harding for videoing all of this stuff. And shout out to Pavel VK for taking so many amazing photos, man. But yeah, I want to leave y'all with the words of one of my favorite punks, Chesky Ramos. And he says, "We're imposters here. I know it in my soul. I also know that we can rip through the skin of a monster's throat. I know that all our knuckles combined can break a mammoth's bones, and all these tiny teeth together can bite through stone." That is the epitome of what punk means to me. But yeah, that's gonna do it for this video. Hopefully y'all enjoyed it. As usual, thank you for living, thank you for loving, thank you for being you, and I'll see y'all next time. Alright, peace out, y'all.
Y'all give it up one time for Myke C-Town. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, so good.